Mental manipulation, rape, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and harassment are just some forms of violence experienced by countless victims in the Bahamas. We surveyed 84 people. 66 were women. 32 respondents said they were sexually abused in their lifetime, while 36 said they were physically abused. We spoke to 2 women who shared their horrific stories in hope of shedding light on the issue and helping those who suffer in silence.
Today, we have with us Assistant Clinical Coordinator of the Bahamas Psychological Association, Megan Johnson, and Criminal Attorney Pinder-Mackey of Pinder-Mackey & Co., who will give us their take on our discussion. Welcome to The Rewind. Okay, so we're back.
We educate, discuss, and bring forth solutions to issues plaguing our community.
I'm Janae Winter.
And I'm Jasmine Lundy. And this is
The Rewind.
Can you both tell us, from your professions, how prevalent is gender-based violence in the Bahamas?
Ty, we can start with you.
Well, there's a lot of gender-based violence, unfortunately. The difficulty I find, though, is that even though the legislation is there, I find it that the victims tend to not follow through with their complaints, and so that creates sort of a cycle of gender-based violence.
The Bahamas Psychological Association, one of our main tenets in our training module is gender-based violence. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the indicators and some of the risk factors, because it is a social ill that has led to so much chaos and pain. It's something that we have to pay attention to always.
So as we mentioned earlier, we interviewed 2 survivors of abuse. The first, Cindy Gaudette. She was just 7 years old when her abuse began. Cindy said her innocence was taken away from her, and the perpetrator even convinced her that this was normal. Let's take a look.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I was told that it was normal. I had undergone such heavy grooming and psychological and mental manipulation. I, of course, had no understanding at the age of 7 as to what was really happening to me. So I didn't think or see anything wrong with it at the time.
Megan, what are your thoughts?
Some of the things that really stood out to me in her video is the thoughts that she was fed as a child, the words that she was fed as a child to justify the behavior. As an adult, they prey on children because they don't have much executive functioning. They can't reason logically and think as an adult. And so if someone that you love and you trust tells you that this is normal, then you'll accept that, because this is who teaches you about the world. This is where you learn about everyday life. Your parents, your home life, those that care for you, they're meaningful. And so the things that they do not only impact us deeply, but shape the way we look at the world. And so if you're getting messages that a violation towards you is normal, then you believe that, even if you don't feel that.
Mm-hmm. Grooming is when a person engages in predatory conduct to prepare a child or young person for sexual activity at a later time. Grooming can include communicating or attempting to befriend or establish a relationship or other emotional connection with the child, parent, or guardian. Does the law say anything about grooming?
I think that's a difficult thing to prove, that someone is grooming someone based on, for what intent, for what purpose. So I don't really see how. I just want to double check, but I don't believe there's anything in relation to grooming.
Wow.
Okay.
No.
Because, for example, in a case where, let's say, a 40-year-old man, he tries to have an inappropriate relationship with a child in school who's about 14, and let's say they exchange texts. He tells her, I bought this dress for you, let's go out.
I think that sort of kind of comes under indecent assault. Well, if by grooming you're meaning attempting at some later point to have sexual intercourse with a minor, definitely the law provides under the Sexual Offences Act for attempting to have sexual intercourse, because I believe that can lead to that, if that can be proved, yes.
Okay, so what if they are past being a minor? So they're 18 and older. Or they groom them until they're 18. I've heard a lot of people say, I can't wait till they're 18 so I could, So what about in a case like that?
Well, I think that's kind of difficult to prove. I mean, unless you have some strict evidence showing maybe some text messages, showing or something of that nature that you attempted to have sex with this individual whilst they were a child. Because the law is speaking of somebody who, if you're attempting to have sex with that child.
And so it would no longer count if they're 18 and they go along and have sexual intercourse with them. But because they're 18 now, they're no longer minor, it's not going to be considered an issue.
I think that would be an uphill battle simply because you're now at the age of consent. And with that being the case, there was no engagement of any sexual act prior to that. So I think that's a difficult one to maneuver.
Okay, moving along, we spoke to another survivor who overcame her abuse and is now an author, an abuse advocate, and a cherished wife. Her name is Levita Thurston, and she was about 15 years old when she was first abused. Although she was not far from the age of consent, which, if you don't know, that is 16, she did not give any consent, and her virginity was stolen from her.
As a parent, your child hurt someone. And not only hurt someone, your adult son hurt somebody, minor child. I figured you should have been more mature to say, come child, and have a conversation with me. But you push me away. You turn around and you rape me also.
After both survivors reached out for help, they soon realized it was unavailable. Ty, what exact law is broken for when a person knows about a crime but doesn't report it?
Well, generally, as far as abuse towards children is concerned, if you're not, for instance, you'd have to be a professional for the law to actually work against you in that regard. So if you're a teacher, if you're a person in a place of trust, perhaps a pastor, a police officer, guidance counselor, those are the persons that the law will now work against for not reporting. But the typical layman, there's not really a law in place compelling you to report abuse. At least of a sexual nature, or any abuse actually at all.
With no help from her family, Cindy sought help from a self-proclaimed man of God, but was met with an extraordinarily shocking revelation.
I grew up in church, and up to that point, I was 13 then, up to that point, the church was my safe place. And I was convinced that the church would help me. Like, these are people that say they love God and they are following the chosen path that God laid out for them. So definitely they would see this as horrendous and want to help me. So I went to the head priest of the church that I was attending at the time, that I grew up in, and he immediately called a meeting. And then he told me to pray about the situation until God changes it. And he sent me away. We never spoke about it again.
So, Megan, my question for you. Now, we often see a lot of stories like this in the Bahamas. A lot of persons, they say, okay, I have a family member, I'm going to report it to you because I trust you. But then the family member turns around and just doesn't care. They want it to be swept under the rug. And so what is the psychological effect on a child when they reach out for help and they don't get it? How does that impact them?
You know, Janae, it's amazing the breadth and width of responses a child can have when they're not heard, especially in relation to a violation. We have children that internalize, so girls typically internalize a lot of their issues, so they may isolate, they may have some behavioral issues, they may become depressed or have low mood, become anxious. For boys, again, they may have behavioral issues or act out. Bahamians call them rude, but a lot of times it's just in response to a need not being met. And so children that have unmet needs, if this is a prolonged situation and there's no resolution, then, you know, it increases the risk of them coping negatively with drugs, alcohol, so many other things. And even some positive things that we turn into coping mechanisms that may not be healthy. So, for example, someone is really smart, and so they decide to dedicate their time to their studies, but at the same time they neglect their social life, or they neglect making connections with those in their age group. And so you'll find them really smart but lack skills to communicate and connect with other people. So it's just so many things that can go wrong. It's really hard to say and capture in just a small snippet, because the mind of the child is such a delicate thing, especially during the formative years. You want to make sure that needs are met, because they can lead to dysfunction later on.
Now, you touched a point that we want to tackle a little bit later on in the show, but I'll get back to that.
Okay.
So let's move on to Lavita. So she recalls actually seeking help from the police, but was met with a shocking response. So let's hear more from her.
I went to the police station and I told them, please come carry me home, come go home with me. If I go by myself, I'm going to die tonight in front of my children. So they laugh and they say, girl, go home and go try out, give that man piece of pea, you know.
And the officer said this to you?
Yeah, a couple of them.
And what were the genders of these officers?
Male. I say, sir, you don't understand. This man has beat me so bad. And if I go home, he's going to beat me. And they still didn't believe me. So I say, okay then, let's do this. Give me 10 minutes. If I don't call you all back, this is where I live, this is where to come. And I direct them where I lived. And when I reached home and I went inside, I heard the doors locking, clack, 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 because there were several locks on the door. And he locked every one of them. And he just got shot about a couple months before that. And he had some crutches. He took the crutch and he broke it on me. Then he had, there was I think it was a Acapulco bottle or some kind of 5-gallon bottle and a bucket. He took them and you ever see a 5-gallon bucket crack on someone? Well, it cracked.
So we've seen in Cindy's case, she went to a trusted source, someone who you would think to go to, and Lavita went to the police. That's who you go to. So in a case like this, like these, when we see people aren't getting the help they need from the people who are supposed to offer the help, how can this impact you psychologically?
I think it creates an environment of untrustworthiness. It's as if the people that are responsible for keeping you safe and protected cannot be trusted. And so a lot of times we internalize that and we use a broad brush, whatever you want to call it, to say that no one can be trusted, that I can only depend on myself, because when I ask for help from the people that are supposed to protect me, they're not there. And so you find that you create a culture where things don't go said, people sweep things under the rug because they've had instances where they were never believed, or people don't take them seriously. You have no reports from males, because look at how men respond often in cases of abuse. There's not an environment where we see their concerns as valid. And so when you invalidate a person time and again, when do you expect them to talk or speak at all? And so things escalate behind the scenes, and people ignore it because it's taboo, it's not attractive, it's ugly. And so if you have that in addition to no one hearing or caring about what's going on, then you allow that ill to grow and it takes over.
Now, for Ty, my question is, we often, even on the news, you listen, everybody says, if something happens to you, if you're hurt, go to the police. That's where you should go. But we just heard Lavita, she went to the police, but they didn't take her report seriously. So I want to know, would there be any legal repercussions for a law officer who doesn't take a, report of crime seriously or no action is done?
Well, there is the Corrupts and Complaints Unit of the Royal Bahamas Police Force. And so one can always take their complaint there.
Okay.
Further to that, if you find that no one's taking you seriously, you can also see an attorney. An attorney can actually institute private prosecution proceedings on your behalf. And so in that instance, the attorney would draft affidavits on your behalf, which will serve as witness statements. A magistrate will review it, and if the magistrate sees that there's merit in this case, then it will be tried in the magistrate's court, just as if the police would have investigated it.
So what about persons who may be turned away because, they say, okay, the legal fees are too much, or they don't want to go through that process, they're afraid, things like that. Like the legal aspect of it may turn them away. What do you have to say to those persons?
I would also suggest the persons who find themselves in these type of situations to probably seek, like for instance, I think the second lady, I think her name was Lavita.
Yeah.
If you're living under the same household as the person who is abusing you, you should probably seek a protection order. From the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Act. Okay. If you are financially incapable, there's always legal aid. And even though legal aid is not free, depending on your financial status, there's a nominal fee involved. I was also made aware that if it is an emergency and you have no funding whatsoever, they will do it for you pro bono. You would have to pay for your filing fees somehow, but the fee is extremely nominal.
Okay. For many victims and survivors, when it feels as though all hope is lost and no one cares about them, no one sees their pain, and there's no justice being served, they turn to what they believe will end their misery. In often cases, it's suicide. And Cindy and Lavita were no different from her suicide.
When I was pregnant with the second child, I drank a bottle of bleach. With it going down, burning my throat, I drank it because I wanted to die and I didn't want my baby to be here and I'm not here. But I couldn't kill the one who was already here, But I wanted to die along with the one who was already inside of me because I felt like, this is too much.
Here we have two completely different women, both victims of abuse. They both cried out for help to several loved ones and authorities, only to be ignored. When they both went to what would naturally be deemed as the proper authorities, they were met with more pain and anguish, which led to their suicide attempts.
But their story continues. After Cindy lost all hope of receiving help at the age of 13, she began to change her persona. She told us that she became a perfectionist to hide her pain and shame of what she was experiencing. Now, Megan, what you touched on earlier, you spoke about, children who withdraw, they change their personalities, or some, they tend to do good things, but, they lose social interest. And so some of our research, we found that this is true, but Cindy's case, she became the opposite. She became an overachiever. She became a perfectionist. So what are your thoughts on Cindy's change in actions? Would you consider this atypical behavior for someone who experiences sexual abuse? Is this a normal behavior change?
I wouldn't call it atypical because every person is different.
Okay.
The way they respond to trauma will be different. And so I'm very cautious in labeling a person's response to trauma. But it is, I think, in alignment, it's directly proportionate to the distress that someone would adjust their thinking patterns to compensate for something that they feel is a stain on their life. So if you feel like something was taken away from you, or you were denied a childhood, you were denied safety and protection, then the natural human response is to survive. And sometimes to survive, people feel like, okay, then I need to double down and do better, do more, do this, do that. And that can be any number of things. So I think her response and reaction to that is not strange at all.
Okay. Now, following up to that, we typically would see overachievement as a good thing. But how do you tell the signs? Like, what are the signs to know the difference of someone who's just an overachiever because they want to do good in school or hobbies versus someone who's an overachiever because of trauma? How do you tell the difference? What are the signs?
Now, that may be tricky, again, because each person is different. Okay. And while we understand that some responses, while good, may come from
coping mechanism.
Right, a coping mechanism. That's not to say that it's not valuable. Right. So we never want to throw away what you would have done in your life to survive. That has gotten you to where you are, and so we have to acknowledge that it's been working. I think my concern would come in where you see that there's some impact on your functioning, like if it impacts you functioning, sleeping, eating, if you find that you're losing moments where you can rest, where you can recuperate, those infringes on, the ability for you to kind of function in different areas. That's where the concern comes in. So I don't want people to think that, okay, I'm an overachiever. Is there some trauma in my life that I have that I need to be mindful of? I think it's important to recognize what you would have been through, of course, but not to absolutely and diagnose yourself because you feel like, okay, then I had this bad thing happen to me and I responded in this way, I need to change. I think it's important to know who you are, have that insight, and be honest with yourself. If what I'm doing may seem good, but there are areas in my life where it's draining me, where I'm overworking myself, or I'm burnt out.
And if they need some assistance with that, they could just call someone like you, help them.
And the sad thing is, and this is something that I'm so passionate about, there is limited access to good, competent mental health services in the country. Those entities that are free, they're so overwhelmed by the population. It's hard to get in, and that's no excuse to not try. But at the same time, there's so many things that convince people that they don't need to go or they shouldn't go. And so sometimes you don't always get access to a trusted professional who can give you insight. And so this is where, we try to inform the public on what to look for, what may be a concern, so that you can do the work at home yourself. And if it's a case where you can't manage, then you reach out.
Awesome. You may be wondering why now? Why talk about being raped and abused? But these survivors have decided to speak up against their abuse and abusers. They say it's time to be the voice for those unspoken.
Do not. Sorry, crying. Do not suffer in silence to maintain someone else's comfort level. You matter. What happened to you or is happening to you matters. And if there are people in your life who would rather you be silent and suffer than to expose the truth, they are not your people. They're not your people. And what happened to you is not your fault.
So we've reached to this point of the discussion, and if you still have questions or questioning the prevalence of gender-based violence in our society, here are the facts we found. The latest statistics released by police show an increase in reported rapes. As of August 23rd, 2022, 51 cases were reported so far for the year, when compared to 48 incidents that were reported in 2021. Statistics also showed that 69 cases of indecent assault and 10 incidents of incest were reported between January 1st and August 23rd of this year. In addition to that, because it keeps going, 39 incidents of unlawful sexual intercourse with a person under the age of 14, and another 37 reported unlawful sex cases with individuals between 14 and 16 years of age. But keep in mind, these are only the reported cases, not the cases that still remain in the dark.
The University of the Bahamas also recently released data related to gender-based violence. According to the study, 1 in 12 women, or approximately 4,000 women, claim to have been raped by their husband. This includes any sexual activity that occurs without consent and refers to sexual assault or sexual violence, including unwanted sexual touching, forced oral sex, and rape, among other sexual acts. And in cases of domestic violence, by October 2021, 2,562 incidents were reported to police, a 35% increase from 2020.
We know the numbers, we hear their stories, but what is being done? The government has some new preventative measures in the pipeline. The Sexual Offenses Act seeks to criminalize marital rape and redefine what consent is. In addition to that, the Minister of Social Services, Obi Wilchcombe, recently announced a new research unit will be responsible for the collection of data on violence against women and children.
And in June of this year, the ministry also launched a new hotline number 711 to report incidents of child abuse for children and the public to easily remember. It is also available for those on the Family Islands. These initiatives show that the government is aware that there is a sexual and domestic violence crisis in the country.
Now, these steps are just the beginning of tackling gender-based violence, but we are not done discussing this topic just yet. Stay tuned for episode 2, where we go a bit deeper with a question and answer segment with our guest. But thank you to our guests, Ty and Megan, for joining us today, and thank you to our viewers for being part of our news first ever podcast. Be sure to like and share this video and look out for part 2. See you next time on The Rewind.